So thank you so much, and welcome everyone. So I'm grateful for this opportunity. So I thank you. For sharing this moment with me tonight, and for showing the interest in what I have to say tonight. So the question of shame. So my name is Sash, and I want to start with a question tonight that was asked during my talk at Vegan Campout. That was almost 3 years ago today, and the question was, do shaming tactics actually help people go vegan? Don't worry, I'm not going to be asking if you're vegan or not, okay? So, because if we're talking about shame, so we're not doing that tonight. Hiya. Welcome. Please come through. Okay, so that question became the starting point for my research, and this presentation is based on that research, and it is currently actually being prepped for publication, and the fully baked version will be available. There will be several hours of workshops and seminars, etc., and they're all in the pipeline. So this is a taster, if you like. And I would like it to be informal and as open as possible. And I hope it gives you something personal to take away tonight. So normally I would start with throwing some t-shirt at the audience. So there will be no t-shirts, I'm afraid. I'm really sorry. The samples are at home. I'm gonna send them to you. Oh no, you're coming to Bournemouth soon. Is that right? Just plugging the event. Anyway, so we're not going to do that tonight, and but I have something else for you. So firstly, I want to thank VARC team for giving me the space, the volunteers, the peer activists, and my partner Chris, who is not here tonight. He couldn't be here because he's working in Blackpool, so I feel a bit lost because he's my media team. He normally runs around taking pictures. So if you want to take pictures on his behalf, please do. Either side will do. They both look good, I think. Last time I checked. And of course, all of you for showing up tonight, no matter what. And most of all, I dedicate this talk to the most vulnerable, the victims, who we are here for. They are non-human animals. So let's, quick disclaimer, I'm not here to tell anybody what to do. I'm here to share what I have discovered throughout my research, and I am here to learn with you, so as we give ourselves permission to be here in the space. What I will do at the end, I will share some practical tools, 3 precisely, that you can start using straight away in your own advocacy. Is the mic okay? Yeah, cool. Because it sounds different from here, and I feel like I'm dipping in and out. No, thank you. So anyway, as we go through this talk, I want to invite you to keep something in mind for yourselves. So think of it as your own takeaway from this session, or your own anchor, whatever that is. So if you notice something sparks, whether it's joy for you, or if something that I might say tonight stirs up a feeling or emotion, try not to change it. Just let it be there. Just notice it, and notice how it feels in your body and what thoughts come with that feeling. So write it down if you like. You can send yourself an email, a message, and just remember the feeling itself. And if you feel safe enough and want to share it with somebody else, please do so, friend, a peer, or myself later on. So this part is completely for you, and it is about curiosity and not self-judgment. And you can also connect with me on social media or email me along with the questions. My contacts are on Hoover app, if you've downloaded it, or if you all downloaded it, or at the bottom on some of the slides. It's a bit of communist red. There's a reason for it. because of my history and my accent, you probably can detect. So let's talk about key takeaways tonight. So we will identify carceralism and its effects as control. One of the key takeaways from tonight's session will be to identify carceralism as control and punishment within activism realm, and we will explain how it impacts advocacy and the movement as a whole. Make sure you stay hydrated. We will also explore how shame-based tactics can backfire, and also how they reduce effectiveness, and we will also define punitive empathy, but I initially named it as carceral empathy. So, and we will distinguish it from genuine care and examine its movement splitting effects as well. Then we will recognize the panopticism and how purity politics become the hidden cage in the movement. I will also introduce 3 practical tools, as I mentioned, and I will also talk a little bit on the last slides, only for a couple of minutes, about ETLIN and how ETLIN can support ethical and resilient leadership within the movement. Okay, a bit of background of my research. So the topic was carceral phenomena in the animal rights movement. And what I was looking at was the presence and impact of punitive attitudes in activism sphere. I used the reflexive thematic analysis to internet-mediated research. So in simple terms, what it means, there are moments when we resort to punishment, particularly using shame or exclusion, and how that can affect the movement as a whole. And the animal rights movement is built on justice, as we all know, and on the idea of ending oppression and extending justice beyond just human exceptionalism, right? But at the same time, what I found during my research, that sometimes we, as activists, fall into those patterns of punishment and control. And that creates some sort of contradiction, because we fight for liberation, right? However, sometimes we reproduce that very logic of colonial control that we are trying to dismantle at the same time. So then throughout the talk, what we'll do is we will build towards answering the question of what is that hidden cage inside the movement. So, what is carceralism? There's a transcription there at the bottom, that's how you pronounce it. Carceralism stems from incarceration, being incarcerated. So it simply means a mindset of control and punishment, and its belief that social problems are best solved by criminalization and the use of disciplinary mechanisms. What is usually linked to, as I mentioned before, it's colonialism, or colonial and conservative traditions. And we see it clearly in places such as prisons, we see it in policing, we see it in systems of surveillance, and carceral logic also shows up in workplaces, it shows at schools, it shows in relationships, and it shows up with your relationship with yourself as well. And so my research found that it can also appear in social justice movements. And that's where it gets really tricky, because it creates that contradiction that I mentioned earlier. And but we don't see it as first. That is the aspect of it that we don't see first as the punitive attitudes of carceralism. Okay, so now I think I missed a slide. There you go, punitive attitudes. Sorry. Too many things to hold. There you go, found it. Anyway, so I found that punitive attitudes are very common in activist conversations and discourse. And what that includes, often they call for harsh sort of sanctions, and they even call for violent retaliation. and it does happen in activism, and where it becomes more about vengeance rather than the advocacy itself. And they also show up in exclusionary practices as well. So on the surface, what we see, so these attitudes may appear, and they're constructed as sort of justice, of course, you know, as a way of expressing solidarity with the victims. However, research shows that retributive tendencies are actually innate to humans. So even toddlers recognize intentional moral transgressions. So when they see another child being naughty on purpose, for example, they're less likely to help them and more likely to protest, and often that expressed through shouting, throwing objects, etc., etc. However, when the witnessed harm is accidental, the reaction is completely different. So that's the experiment's been done a while ago. So that suggests that humans are wired to punish the perceived wrongdoing. And what the problem here is that the punishment always falls on the person, not the behavior itself. And when somebody feels punished, or when we feel punished, the most common response is, of course, defensiveness, right? So, and that's fight, flight, freeze, and there's a fourth one, fawn. But that's for another talk. So, and what we also do is, it also leads to dishonesty. So when we're sort of fear, so like why children often lie, for example, is because they're too scared to tell the truth, because truth will be punished, essentially. So, and then some of us might actually withdraw altogether. And of course, none of us like to be screamed at, right? So the conflict escalates and then becomes, because the punishment itself is inflicted on the person, not the act itself, because you just can't punish the behavior. So that's why it's kind of attached to the person. So are you with me so far? I made a joke at Vegan Camp Out, I don't know if anyone was there, and it just kind of flopped flat, and it just didn't work because I'm just naturally really not funny. And it's just, you're supposed to laugh, like, but that's the funniest part, I guess. So what I said, right, if you like falling asleep, I would rather you having a good nap and enjoy it, because otherwise if you keep yourself up, then you're not going to kind of do either. So do one of those things. And it's kind of, yeah, and I looked at somebody who yawned at the time, and they came to my talk last time again, and I tried to make that joke, and that's when it just went the wrong way. And they thought I was talking about them again. And that was really embarrassing, so they kind of found me kind of between the talks and asked me, which is actually really brave, not brave, sorry, wrong word, courageous and vulnerable thing at the same time. Because apparently I'm scary with tattoos and all. So, move on. It's a pretty slide, so it's not just words. So, what we're looking here is the shame as punishment and activism. Just have a look. I skipped the slide. Anyway, so shame, that's another theme that I found in the research, and the use of shame and shaming tactics in advocacy and activism as well. And it is often used to provoke moral awareness. And which is quite rightly, we try to kind of wake people up from sort of, up to their role and their responsibility or accountability, and their role in supporting that harm that they might not be necessarily fully aware of. So, and the examples would be where I'm going to use Dr. Melanie Joy's term, pre-vegans, are being called murderers, animal. Sorry, don't run from the station on a hot day. Anyway, So they're also called animal abusers. Nobody likes to hearing that, particularly if they don't believe that they are. Often activists, or we, in fact, I've done it myself, accusing other peers of betraying, almost like betraying the cause itself, if we support sort of welfare organization, welfare practice, etc. Although my view of welfareism, again, it's for a different talk, but I can completely understand where they're coming from. However, it's for me, if I see somebody struggling, I'm not going to just tell them, well, so you, I am just for full liberation. I would give them water. If you see me struggle, you would give me water, right? So it's, to me, that kind of concept. I don't know if I'm simplifying it or not, but I totally see it, and I'm not here to argue either. So interestingly enough, some of the language that I found was so severe and was so violent that I could not even include it in my transcript. For ethical reasons. So the intent is to trigger reflection, of course. But the focus again is on the intent rather than, we only just started. So the focus then becomes on the intent. You know, when we hear, it's like, oh, I did not intend, or that was not my intention. Yes, fair enough, you know, apology accepted. However, then the power still lies with the perpetrator, not with the victim or of whatever that happened. So we're kind of forgetting the impact that our intention might actually cause. So shame is also used to enforce boundaries, of course, inside the movement, such as gatekeeping, and polices who is considered true activists, heard that, and who is considered a true vegan and who is not. And there were phrases like, you're not a real vegan if you don't engage in activism, for example. And again, I sort of truncated it and I rephrased it because, like I said, the language is really violent in some places. And that comes from people that believe in, you know, liberation, freedom, and life, etc. So, and that can create purity politics and therefore hierarchy in itself. And that can lead to divide into sort of outsiders and insiders. So other research also shown that what shame does, it's rarely leads to transformation. We'll talk about it in a bit, why I say rarely, because it does lead to some transformation. But we'll talk about it in more detail later. So instead, what happens, welcome. So what it does is it tends to trigger defensiveness, I mentioned that again, withdrawal, but also counter-attack. Okay, so when people feel ashamed, of course we naturally would want to sort of defend ourselves, right? So, and when we defend ourselves, what then happens? We then resist to problem solve, because problem solving part of it is kind of forgotten almost, put to the side because we've got priority. I'm not safe, therefore I need to run away, right? So there is no headspace for any kind of problem solving at all left. So over time, what it does is it contributes to emotional exhaustion or emotional attrition. And that's prevalent in the animal rights movement or any advocacy movement, justice movement, etc. So, and that can also lead to burnout. And we then end up spending energy and financial support, etc., just managing sort of disagreements and conflict, even though not all conflict is bad. But instead of building community, we're kind of wasting our time and resources on just doing that. So just very briefly, what actually shame is, and how to distinguish it from guilt. So if you imagine you've done something bad, and you feel bad about it, you repair quickly, apologize, and you make amends. And that's guilt. Then comes shame. You have done something bad, you feel bad, so you must be bad. And that's the difference. Well, I'm pointing it here at my chest, but it's not chest, it's actually here in the brain. So, but I'm going to give you another one. And this is something that is not talked about often, and it's infamy. Okay, and infamy is, again, I don't want to reduce it, but to put it simply, I've done something bad, I feel bad, I must be bad, and everybody knows about it. And that's the difference. And that can have detrimental effect on mental health. So, so I want to kind of illustrate what happens here in self-perpetuating kind of shame system. So in this diagram, I think shows it well. I'm proud of it. And this is how shame tends to move in that cycle. Then, so it begins with that moment where somebody feels exposed to a threat or judgment or anything like similar. And then they feel, like I said earlier, like they have done something wrong. And then what happens, then it turns quickly into shame response. And that feeling is, I did something wrong. There must be something wrong with me as a person. So an interesting thing, I'm actually have masters in forensic psychology, and in forensics there is a concept where an applicant for a particular role is required to hold conflicting beliefs. And that's what we kind of exploring here. So you can be good and bad at the same time. And there's nothing wrong with that. So, and then from there, we usually try to sort of protect ourselves, and that might look like, so becoming defensive, shutting down, denying it, or pushing back, and sometimes attacking or counterattack. And that reaction then affects the relationships. And then it can lead to negative conflict, because I also see that there is a positive notion of conflict as well. It then creates distance and then exclusion. So, and instead of resolving anything, what it does, it just feeds back into more shame. And the cycle continues. And that's why it's self-perpetuating. So, and instead of kind of supporting reflection or change, it just keeps us stuck and disconnected from each other. No problem. So some authors believe that shame is relational, meaning that there needs to be another person for shame to be activated. And usually starts with our caregivers. And then if you exposed or due to prolonged exposures or to this shame, or the feeling is believed to then turn into chronic shame. So again, that's for another talk. Okay, next one is carceral empathy. This is one of the original ideas that emerged through the research, which I earlier said punitive empathy as well, but carceral empathy sort of suits this particular presentation, I think. So it is a currently working term, and what I'm trying to explain with this term is that the punishment is then viewed or presented as some kind of care and compassion. And yeah, of course, on the surface we view it and it appears as compassion. However, in reality, it's something completely different. So what research also showed is that often carceral empathy stems from what's called empathic distress or vicarious distress, when our own overwhelm then takes over and gets mixed up with that empathy and advocacy, and we react in ways that to relieve our discomfort, rather than sort of support the other person. And then rather than, instead of sort of being other focused when we're talking to somebody, it then becomes internal. So what carceral empathy does, it then becomes self-focused, and it's about, and then it becomes about discharging your own kind of feelings of anger, helplessness, and shame itself. So it can also feel urgent, of course, and justified. However, what it does, it reflects the very carceral logic that we are trying to dismantle. The idea was like, oh, you've done something wrong, so there's something wrong with you, so you must be punished. So, and that reproduces the same patterns of control, exclusion as well, which we'll talk about in a minute. And also, it kind of we use the carceral empathy to justify sort of actions or decisions of who belongs in the movement and who doesn't, who deserves to be punished, and who should be exiled, excluded from the movement. Or from advocacy itself. So, and this impact is actually very predictable, and where movements split into sort of fractions, and then the trust erodes, etc., and then burnout spreads like fire. So we then might have the allies that we might have and then pushed away, further away, if we sort of resort to those tactics. And then carceral empathy, what it does is also reminds us that not everything that feels like compassion actually functions as one. And the three practical tools that I will leave you with at the end, we'll address that. One of the tools will address that. So with lack of reflection, regulation, self-reflection, self-awareness, regulation, that feels like, well, you know, I care, I'm empathetical, it's got to be stopped, it's very urgent. And then it turns into punishment. When I talk about carceralism or punitive attitudes, and since we mentioned prisons, I think it's important mentioning panopticon or panopticism. And that is the key concept here. And the word panopticism stems from the Jeremy Bentham's design of a prison, panopticon, and it translates from Greek as all-seeing. So it's from a prison from 18th century. So as you can see, it's a circular building with the tower in the middle. So it's like a hole in the middle, and all the cells are located on the outer edges of each floor, and each floor, I think this particular design had about, I think 92 or 98 cells in each, and the central tower in the middle, and each of the floor was supposed to be guarded by one prison guard watching all 98 cells. So if you think about it, it's like, that's a lot of cells to keep an eye on, right? On the floor. So actually, the idea behind it is to actually remove the punishment element of it, so that people didn't feel like they were punished or they're being watched. So, however, the prisoners did not know that they've not been watched, but it created an idea of being watched. And the prison guards didn't see the prisoners because the window was so small, and there was an outer window on the outer wall, which then would project their sort of relief, the shape of their head. That's all they were seeing. They're just moving head through that window because of the light coming from the back of them. So they didn't know where the prisoner was anyway, and they couldn't watch them all at once. So therefore, it only created an illusion of that surveillance. So later on, last century, philosopher Michel Foucault took that idea further, and he explained how the power works through external control, but through self-surveillance. So he then coined the term panopticism, and that's where surveillance becomes internalized. And over time, The prisoners didn't need to guard it, didn't need to be guarded at all, but they watched themselves. And that became sort of self-perpetuating. And what I mean by the hidden cage inside the movement, and that is the hidden cage inside the movement. So the wheel of oppression of self and others just keeps spinning all by itself. And we're doing it. So even those of us, all of us here, who fight oppressions, we tend to kind of reproduce those behaviors, and they do sadly stem from that colonial concept of carceralism. So instead of being watched from the outside, we police ourselves as well as each other. So you see this in kind of purity politics, and it's checking with another person whether they're radical enough, whether they're vegan enough, whether they're active enough, and then judging others and yourselves as well harshly, but also fearing that judgment ourselves. So the surveillance is no longer outside, then is inside us, looking out at ourselves. So it's quite, and that's the phenomena of panopticism and then carceralism itself. So, and that's when shame and punishment then, as well as then I'm gonna bring in exclusion into it as well as form of punishment. They stop being just, you know, activism and advocacy tactics. So, and they just woven into the fabric, the very fabric of the movement. So, are we okay for time? So quickly, so psychology of punishment, so why we punish. So I think we've got about another 15 minutes, if that's okay. So why we punish. So again, there's evidence that suggests that we're wired to punish intentional wrongdoing. And when someone acts aggressively towards us, what happens? And I'll give you an example, activists towards a pre-vegan, for example, whether we think that we did something wrong or not, the instinct is pushed back and it backfires. So the problem with punishment is that when it is done to the person, obviously not behavior, like I said, you can't punish the behavior. So then we feel attacked. So we then protect ourselves through the defensiveness I mentioned earlier. And however, there is the biological layer to that. Again, there's evidence on aggression that shows serotonin levels play a role in regulating behavior, with higher levels of serotonin showing reduced sort of aggression. But then what happens when you already feel down? Emotional attrition, burnout, etc. Where do we get it from? So, and then also changes in stress chemicals can then can kind of push us forward towards sort of more reactive and punitive responses. So whilst the biology can explain sort of the impulse behind the punitive attitudes, but it does not mean that it can lead to better outcomes, sadly. And also in criminology, research shows that sort of demonstrates similar patterns. So where the punishment is kind of used kind of in a different sort of short term. So it works short term. However, it does not build the cooperation. So if anything, it creates resentment. Okay, so then what happens in activism? That means that the connection is then ruptured, and that leads us to dissociate, disconnect, and fragment. So when we feel ashamed, the last thing we need is more shame. So, and what's the cost of carceralism? When shame is and punishment are normalized, first of all, it's fragmentation, so the groups split apart. There's alienation of newcomers, for example, like being curious, stopping to ask questions, and then being shamed or told you are a murderer or an animal abuser or a sort. So, and most people will just choose to walk away from that encounter and just feel excluded or not invited in. And the third one is burnout and shame and punishment. They eat away at ourselves personally and the movement as well. So when we constantly sort of judge one another, and when anger and moral policing, they dominate us, so the emotional load then becomes simply unsustainable. And that's what's referred to as emotional attrition. And the fourth one is the replication of oppression. Mentioned that before, but we kind of mirror that carceral logic and the authoritarian logic, and in that that's where the contradiction comes from. And then, of course, the finally is its effectiveness. And there is plenty of research has been done and plenty of evidence that can sort of demonstrate that shaming and moral condemnation, they rarely create lasting sort of change. Instead, what they do is they're just triggering the sort of defense mechanism. So that's some of the costs of carceralism, but there you go. Sorry. The true cost, or the additional cost, as I say, the true cost of punitive attitudes is what we cannot achieve. And the cost is then carried by them. So the ones that we are trying to protect. So now, what are the solutions? So empathy, repair, and connection. So of course, not all activists fall into punitive logic. So again, there's evidence. Also saw examples of people who actively sort of resisted when I was doing my research, and they chose empathy, and they displayed patience and inclusion over punishment, and you could see the responses and how people then interact and engage with those conversations is a lot more positive and effective. So what I want to mention is one model that also came up in my research is Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous, AA. And why I mention this is it's effective for many reasons, but what it does is it creates the platform with accountability, there's empathy, and also there's support. And the interesting thing is the members, they share their experience, they show openness, and again, there's evidence suggesting that openness is then shown to increase empathy. So they show openness, they admit their struggles, and then they're met with the recognition instead of being pushed out and exiled. And that's regardless of the history of their past, criminal or not. So you could actually sit next to quite sort of violent a felon, and yet you still be welcome because there's the one kind of goal to make people healthier. So, and we can learn from that. So harm, if we sort of witness or met with harm and disagreement, the question that we often ask is, or we can ask ourselves is, how do we repair, instead of kind of resorting to questions such as, who do we punish? Okay, so another, I think the very important thing, accountability, is that you can still invite somebody into accountability, but without kind of shame. And that's what advocacy is about. And the practitioners in sort of various professions, that's exactly what they would do. Okay, now, good news. I don't know, I should have broken it up with something else. Maybe I'll bring t-shirts next time and throw them at you. But do enjoy your nap. And it's not kind of addressed to anyone, aimed at anyone in particular. Let's address the 3 practical tools. Again, I'm not telling you what to do, but this is something that I've experienced and I practiced myself. It wasn't something that I've imagined. It was a few years of trying different kind of ways, and also statistical analysis as well. The first one, maybe for water. So check the drivers, or I also say motivators. And by motivation, so when you advocate, what is the real driver? And by that, I don't mean that your health, the environment, whatever that is, the religion, nothing to do with kind of you and your kind of daily activities. I am inviting sort of a look at it kind of a deeper dive or drive. So the one that gets you up and moving. So where does it really come from? So of course, in this kind of in this room at least, is for the non-human animals. So then what again, evidence shows that the shame itself can be a good motivator, which kind of might contradict a little bit what I said earlier, but bear with me. Shame then becomes the motivator, and it's not sustainable because again, it's about you. So it's, well, I'm just gonna go and break that rule. So therefore, if we advocate from a place of our own shame, frustration, it is then becomes less about the victims, of course. So and we end up speaking from our wounds. And it becomes motivated by shame, which is not what really what it means. So the second one is accountability. Again, just checking what that actually means, accountability. And I'll give you an example, and that's particularly crucial in street activism or street outreach. For example, when people who sort of walk past you whilst you're there, they don't stop, and they, of course, keep walking, right? They become unchallenged. So there's no accountability there. But the one person who stops and talks to you, right? They does stop and listen. So the one that shows curiosity then ends up being accountable for all suffering, right? So, and this is the really, really important thing here. Almost as if they are being scapegoated for all the suffering of all the other people around the world. So they just get weighed down by this, the guilt, the shame of the billions, trillions in fact, and billions of land animals, and the whole food system. So then no wonder that what we hear in street advocacy, or when we speak to anybody else, like, I am the only person, I can't make a difference alone, the government should do something, everyone else does it, so why just me? So these are not excuses, right? So they're actually natural defensive responses. And that is a response to punishment or being punishments for something that they simply find it too big to carry by themselves. Okay, so so checking accountability means that keeping it realistic and kind of not too symbolic. So, and relating it to that person that you're speaking with. So, and keeping the focus on their own choices, so not the entire system. So, and then the final tool is empathy. It is that simple. And so invite empathy invite the person that you're speaking with into that empathy for the victims. Okay, whilst being empathetic to the person that you're speaking with as well. Remember, holding two conflicting views or more than one conflicting view is not easy, takes a lot of practice, and we're all human, so it's okay, allow yourself kind of make mistakes, that's fine. But we just end up being like a good or bad, we end up splitting, etc. So, but just invite the person and see it from the perspective of a victim. And that tends to kind of be more sustainable. Okay, final slide. Wow, a couple of minutes. Etlin. So, what is Etlin? Okay, so my team and I have been working on it for about the last year. So, and this is just a glimpse, just one slide, not even a tip. It's a tip of a tip of a tip of an iceberg. And it's called Ethical Leadership Initiative, or ETLIN. And it's kind of, we base it on kind of simple concept that if we want to change the world, we must return to ourselves. So we must start from ourselves first. And the initial kind of stages of it were where we recognized through, again, research that the movement, our movement is decentralized. It's completely unregulated. How do you regulate justice movement? So, however, it is powerful, but it comes with its own challenges. One of those challenges is like witnessing and fighting the division, and it seems like impossible things to tackle without empathetic and healthy, supported leadership, right? So, however, I do realize that at the moment, often and many of our leaders simply don't get that support. And yet they are expected to support others and then advocate as well. And then those leaders then expected to advocate for the victims. So essentially, it's like you can't give something that you don't have. It is, you know, again, I don't want to reduce this whole huge concept, but that can be described as that. So what it will do, it will provide leaders with what they need, we think they need. That, again, it's not something that I just made up. It comes from the survey that we are still in the process of doing it, but that's the data is showing. So that's what they believe that they need to succeed in order to care for others. And that includes the mental health support, there. Training, mentorship, it will be values-based guidance, practical skills in managing people's conflict, and of course money. Let's not forget that, very important. So, and because we want that united movement, we can't just hope for it, so we have to build it. And that means that investing in leadership that is ethical, when it's collaborative and resilient, and not just, you know, where we just end up empathy numbing ourselves just to keep going. And so for me, the way forward comes down to those three things. That's integrity, empathy, and dignity. And I believe that's from human rights. And I think it comes from the UK. So why not? And speaking with integrity, inviting empathy, we've addressed all of that before, honoring that dignity, because we all deserve dignity. We all need dignity. And that's sort of the most effective ways to find understanding and then move towards kind of repair of that rupture. I believe, again, Melanie Joy terms it as relational literacy, that's it. Again, I'm not sure about literacy part. It's a shame she's not there. Hopefully I'll bump into her later, I'll have a chat. But similar to kind of emotional intelligence, talk to me about it. Emotional intelligence, my favorite topic. A very cute idea. It doesn't exist. So, yeah, I know a few things on Spearman G, so yeah, ask me about it. General intelligence. But they're really cute, kind of, very helpful kind of educational program, that's all it is. So, anyway. ETLIN delivers practical support as well through 4 core programs, and that's ETLIN Passport, ETLIN Bank, ETLIN Curator, and ETLIN Architect. And we also want to give voices to younger people, because if they can't vote, but they've got amazing ideas, so that's where ETLIN Architect comes with. So what they do is together they provide this structured kind of development and supporting resources resources of reflective practice and leadership, that is designed to kind of strengthen the ethical, sustainable, and collaborative leadership. Yeah. So that's the end of the slides. Oh, that was pretty. We missed it. Let's do it again. There you go. I worked so hard on it. I'm going to show it off. Why not? So, yeah, I want to thank you all for being here with me today, for listening and reflecting. So, and if you'd like to continue the conversation, I put in here the QR code on the slide. There is no QR code. But at the bottom there, quite easy, /_Jolliffe, find me on social media or email address. And that's it. Do we have time for questions?
Yes, yeah, we got 5 minutes. Let me have a wee look.